Well, Josh, thank you for being with us. Dr. Josh Storrs Hall is an independent scientist and author. He was a founding chief scientist of Nanorex Inc., which is developing a CAD system for nanomechanical engineering. He remains a member of Nanorex's Scientific Advisory Board, as well as a research fellow of the Institute for Molecular Manufacturing. His research interests include molecular nanotechnology and the design of useful macroscopic machines using the capabilities of molecular manufacturing. His background is in computer science, particularly parallel processor architectures, artificial intelligence, particularly agoric and genetic algorithms as used in design and reversible computing. He was the founder and moderator of the Sci.Nanotech news group for a decade. He is also known as the originator of the utility fog concept. His most recent book is Beyond AI, meaning artificial intelligence, creating the conscience of the machine, published by Prometheus Books. A previous book is Nanofuture, which is about real nanotechnology. And the book that'll serve at least as a starting point for our conversation today is Where is My Flying Car? A Memoir of the Future Past, published originally in 2018. Josh is a proponent of replacing roads and internal combustion vehicles with flying cars. These are some of the milder innovations that nanotechnology can make not only possible, but economical, not to mention safe. Another interest of yours is space travel. So Josh, I was explaining before we got on that two of the entrepreneurs featured in my book and in this podcast are Henry Ford and then the Wright brothers. And so the advent of the automobile and the self-propelled flying machine more than 100 years ago. And so I'd had you on my wish list to be on this podcast. So thank you for being here. I think I read your book before I wrote mine, so probably not too far after the publication, but I thought it was just a fascinating thing to start with. A really deep question. Why don't we have flying cars? And me, perhaps like you, grew up watching the Jetsons, and that's included in your book as well. And so hearkening back to watching perhaps Saturday morning Jetsons issues. But at the beginning of your book, you write about a flight experience, perhaps mirroring something like the rest of us has had, where you were flying from California, I believe, San Francisco International to New Jersey, back to the East Coast. So you wrote, the whole trip has taken from door to door 14 and a half hours. My net speed for the 2,450 miles from hotel to house was 169 miles per hour. The Boeing 737 I flew on had a cruising speed of 514 miles per hour. Imagine that I had a flying car of my own that could cruise at 500 miles per hour. The trip would have taken less than 5 hours, a third of what it actually took. In fact, I could have saved time with a flying car only half as fast as the airliner, since I was up early anyway. I could have left at 5:30 a.m. California time, not flown 100 miles past my house to New Jersey, and after 10 hours in the air, gotten home some 6 hours earlier than I actually did. Other than travel experience, what's the origin story of the book? Although trying to improve travel experience is certainly motivation enough, but how does it touch on your work and research interests? Because it did so fairly broadly in my reading.
Well, as a matter of fact, I spent much of my career studying not just the nuts and bolts of computer architecture, but nanotechnology and artificial intelligence. And these are both technologies that have been predicted and worked on and considered visionary, and flying cars are too. And I have a thing for flying. I'm a pilot, private pilot, and that sort of thing. So the question is, why didn't we get nanotechnology? Why didn't we get artificial intelligence? Why didn't we get flying cars? And it's all the same kind of thing. And so when I sat down to write the book, I thought I was going to be able to get it out in time for the 50th anniversary of the Jetsons, but I didn't. But it turns out that it's a much deeper subject than I realized, because instead of just saying, look at the cool flying cars we might have had, I started getting into the deeper issues of why didn't we get them. And that is actually basically that's what took the 8 years to write the book was digging into that. But it was originally intended as my memoirs. So I had essentially retired and was just having a fun time doing whatever came to hand. And so the flying car issue was something that had always sort of intrigued and bothered me. And so I decided to dig into it.
Well, a great retirement project to both challenge yourself, but to challenge a whole bunch of other people at the same time for asking what is one central question, but leads to a whole bunch of other really good questions as well. You give a history of inventors and entrepreneurs working on versions of flying cars, and I was maybe a little bit aware of some of that, but there's actually a fairly deep history of this. But could you tell us about what some of the notable efforts were by inventors and entrepreneurs to create flying cars, or at least something that represents somewhat of a hybrid between what we have today for either airplanes or helicopters and automobiles?
Well, as a matter of fact, your guy, Henry Ford, became particularly interested. If you ever go down to, where is it, in Florida, on the west coast of Florida, where both Henry Ford and Fort Myers, I think it was, had both Henry Ford and Thomas Edison had estates right next to each other where they would go down on vacation.
And they hung out together.
Yeah. Yes. So anyway, one of the things you'll see down there is Henry Ford's attempt to build an airplane for the masses, and he seriously thought it was going to happen, and with good reason, because he had already done it with automobiles. I mean, the automobile was a toy for the rich until Ford got there, and he just changed the way the world worked. And he thought, well, okay, I could do it again. And it didn't quite, but I think the other really interesting attempt by somebody who had a chance was the autogyro, which was Pitcairn, who was the founder of the company that ultimately became Eastern Airlines, he was the first person who built an airplane that could successfully and reliably carry the mail up and down the East Coast. Mm-hmm. And so he benefited from getting the mail routes because he had no plane that could do it and nobody else did, because he was a serious engineer. I mean, you look at his planes and for 1930 technology, they're substantial stuff, and they could do the job. So he built an airline and an empire and a manufacturing concern and all that sort of stuff. And then he went to Spain and ran into Sierra, who had invented the autogyro. And he just caught the bug. I mean, I don't know exactly what it was, but he says, "Okay, this is it. We're gonna build planes for the million." And an autogyro is a really, really cool thing. I mean, I've learned to fly them too, and it's a lot simpler than a helicopter in many ways, which means you can manufacture it for a lot less money than and it's more reliable if it's built right, and it's safer because you can cut the power on the gyro and land it on a dime just like you would a helicopter. But the main difference between a gyro and a helicopter is that the helicopter can take off straight up, and the gyro can't. It needs runway to take off, although not to land. So it's but that was in the 30s, and the thing that clobbered him was the thing that clobbered a whole bunch of other people who were just about to start trying to build flying cars of a whole bunch of different designs. But the convertible car to airplane was probably the most common one, and what killed them all was the war. I mean, basically, all of a sudden, the aviation industry quadrupled in size. But the machines being built were all, war machines, highly expensive, as powerful as possible, totally the opposite of, the family car. And so basically by the time the war was over, the aviation industry as a whole had been pretty radically transformed and was just not in the league of the sort of thing, producing anything that ordinary people could buy.
Yeah, and if Ford would have been one of the companies to potentially at least invest in the area, they for sure ended up having to invest a lot in manufacturing airplanes during the war, at least if I'm remembering my history correctly. Yeah, and you note, and maybe from a history perspective, yeah, we like to tell stories like World War II pulled the country out of depression, which from an economist perspective is just not correct. And having war to solve any problem seems to me, anyway, kind of not a very good story, right? This tragic loss of millions of lives. There's got to be better ways. But anyway, you tell the story of the war kind of changing where resources were devoted, but still coming out of the war, the number of people with pilot's licenses, the number of people purchasing private planes, the number of private planes manufactured went up. But eventually that went down. And you mentioned that you obtained your pilot's license. And if I read the book correctly, you did that as part of the work on the book, which is pretty cool. But talk a little bit about that history of manufacturing private planes, the number of private pilots that they are, and also just kind of around that, how your experience becoming a pilot maybe informed some of your conclusions and storytelling in the book.
Well, we came out of the war with an interesting but incorrect popular understanding of airplanes. And during the war, airplanes were used for as much as possible, simply because it was fast and they had plenty of people that were willing to fly them and got trained by the Army Air Forces, which also became the Air Force. But the thing is that you get out of the war and all of a sudden things are different. And in particular, flying machines of the kind, they had huge numbers of crashes. They had a lot of people flying who hadn't gotten anywhere near enough training, and the type. The airplanes were big and overpowered, and because they had to be to fight with the other ones that were big and overpowered on the other side. But the fact is that it made flying a very dangerous business. And when the war was over, all of a sudden, people realized that over the next 5 years, while all the production of the people who thought, okay, now we don't have the war to hold us down, we can start building flying cars for everybody. And yet two things happen. A, the baby boom, and so everybody's more interested in nurturing their family. And then the fact that it turns out that the airplanes of the day were, especially the military airplanes of the day, were introduced in a culture or a zeitgeist that didn't care too much about danger, because you had to do it or somebody would shoot you anyway. And so you had to get your job done no matter what the cost or what the risk anyway. And so when that flipped back over to a more domestic civilian zeitgeist in the post-war years, the kind of technologies that took off instead were house building and producing food and all the family stuff, and cars. I mean, I think the number of cars being built were just took off, because the war was actually worse than the Depression as far as car ownership was concerned. All the manufacturing was going into war machines, and people's cars were 5 years old.
Well, you couldn't buy tires, you couldn't buy basic equipment.
Right. Yeah. So the the war had sort of made people realize um, wrong things about the specifics and the realities of flying machines. Um, and so there was something of a correction, a readjustment in the culture. But by the 60s, it had actually started it actually started taking off again. So the number of private planes just went up like you would have expected it to. About the time the technology got good enough to produce planes that were in fact reasonably safe. I mean, the one that I had was a perfectly reliable machine, even though it was 30 years old. And then what happened? What happened was ambulance chasers. Anytime you built an airplane. 30 years later, somebody gets drunk and flies it into a house. The people that got hit, or the relatives of someone killed in the aviation industry, and that was around the mid 70s, I think. It was that time period is when that all happened.
Yeah, and yeah, kind of coming forward into the mid 60s, and you give lots of evidence of it through cultural indicators and the Jetsons and all of this. But, you make the case that by the mid 1960s, about 60 years ago, many were sure that there would be flying cars by the time we get to today, by the 2020s. And
well, we should have them. I mean, that was not a bad prediction. And you look at the technology that we have today, and we ought to have something much better than 30-year-old airplanes for the multitude of people. And it's not that people ought to be able to just buy one, hop in, and fly away in it. I got a pilot's license, and it's a little onerous compared to what it ought to be. But they're working on that. They're actually changing the rules for light sport aircraft, for example, right now. And so there will be a slightly better world as far as the red tape is concerned within a year or two. But the main thing is to allow people who manufacture the machines to actually use all the technology that we have. You ought to be able basically to get into let's just say it was a helicopter. We don't have to worry about a completely new invented kinds of machines. Helicopter makes a perfectly decent flying car. A Robinson 44 goes as fast in the air as my Beechcraft did. And in fact, the instrument panel looks almost exactly the same. It's harder to fly. But nowadays, there's enough, if you do a fly-by-wire intelligent pilot's assistant in the helicopter, it's basically as easy as navigating on Google Maps. You just, you have a map up there, you point, you say, go here, and here you go.
Well, I work in agriculture, and we have that technology for tractors and combines and things like that. There's somebody behind the wheel, but technology's driving it, software's driving it, essentially. And so,
well, I mean, if you really want to see just how good the technology is, just go look at drones. I mean, there are quite a number of them. They're just plain flat out autonomous. But then there are various stages in terms of if you want to control them completely. If you're a hot racer that competes with them, you want to be able to get in there and do as much as you can. But the fact is that they have autonomous drones that can do just as well as the best piloted drones. on a race course, in various, fairly easy jobs like inspecting things or, spraying crops or anything like that. That's where the technology is for control. So if you could only build a helicopter you don't have to worry about funky machines, even though funky machines would make them better. I mean, as I talked about in the book, I developed a theory, an economic theory of how valuable a flying car would be. And it turns out that one of the most valuable parts of a good flying car would be that it was fast.
Indeed. Josh, you've mentioned culture and the zeitgeist before, and you write quite a bit about culture in the book and its influence on how technology is accepted, how, regulatory and legal structures. And anyway, so you note that technologically we as a culture have become a lot less adventurous in the last half century. And thus, to guess what we might have done, you note that we have to kind of pass the limits of what's possible and speculate on what might have been discovered or been invented had the culture been different. And you note that that's a project that's fraught with peril, but that's the same sort of reason that I enjoyed going back to these case studies of historic entrepreneurs. Because you can say, okay, somebody would have invented the affordable automobile eventually without a Henry Ford. Okay, somebody would have invented the self-propelled airplane without the Wright brothers, and maybe that's the case. But would have it been done as soon, as well, and at scale? You don't know. So you're going through sort of the same exercise, but trying to bring forward to the present, right? Where would have we been, from a cultural perspective? So, what is it you think happened with the culture, and what are some of your thoughts on why kind of things have changed in the last 50 years?
Well, there are several good theories. Most obvious one is that you ascend the hierarchy of needs to the point where you're pretty well taken care of as far as food, shelter, clothing, and that sort of stuff is concerned. And you sort of start shifting into being concerned about social stuff. And that happened in terms of the general level of affluence of Americans. That happened in the 60s, and sure enough, the weird social stuff just came creeping out of the woodwork. So that's one thing that happened. And there are a whole bunch of other theories that you could kind of mix in there, but my guess is it was a perfect storm. I mean, you pick your favorite three theories, and all of them happened at the same time. And the 60s were funky as far as culture was concerned. The 70s were where it all took effect, and all the various flat lines started happening.
Yeah. I mean, you note the 60s slogan, "Make love, not war," kind of sums up at least part of this cultural shift from bravery to sensuality.
Well, that was the other big one, was that we quit having wars. I mean, we had World War I, we had World War II, and what happened, and it's not probably as well understood as I think it ought to be, which is that nuclear weapons are what caused us to quit having wars, because the decision makers in Washington suddenly realized, if we do have a war, we're not going to make it through. We're not going to be able to sit here and watch the boys go off and be cannon fodder. We're under the gun, literally. And so, I mean, just to understand how real that was, there are some of them that are national parks now. But launch sites for the Nike Hercules anti-aircraft missiles that they had, these things were among the most remarkable gadgets ever invented by Americans. And they were missiles that could take off following a radar contact for an incoming air fleet, which was assumed to be nuclear armed. Okay, so there's 100 planes from Russia that's going to come over and bomb Washington or New York City or whatever, and they all have nuclear bombs in them. So if even one gets through, you're toast. So this missile was rigged to take off at, and it was a gigantic rocket because it could take off and go 100 miles in a couple of seconds, and it was nuclear armed, and it could actually blow up a nuclear bomb in the middle of a fleet of airplanes and knock them all out. But that's what we were building and deployed all over the country. And you start seeing that and understanding, A, what it could do, and B, why it had to do it, and say, geez, we probably shouldn't, so nuclear powered, nuclear armed countries have quit having wars directly with each other. And so the second half of the century, warfare started being all about pushing little pawns around in the rest of the world, and not actually going to war directly with the other parties that were nuclear armed themselves. And that's why we had a relatively peaceful second half of the century compared to the first. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So that got added to the hierarchy of needs thing. That's another one of the wings of the perfect storm that came in.
Yeah, and I was in high school in the 1980s, and so I don't remember sort of the bomb shelters, duck and cover era, let's say, of an earlier generation. But I do remember when I was a sophomore, junior in 1983, there was this movie that came out called The Day After that was on a national network. These things we used to have for young people out there. And anyway, the Reagan administration was rearming, and so Hollywood in the media, I think it's safe to say, was up in arms about what they perceived as a warmongering president and the threat, again, of nuclear war that had never went away, but maybe was higher in the cultural consciousness than it had been in a little while. And, I had a friend who was maybe a more careful planner than me, and I grew up in Nebraska, and so he planned our escape route in the case of nuclear Armageddon. And, Nebraska has Sac Air Force Base and a number of nuclear silos that we also plotted out. And I remember telling him at some point, Brent was his name, Brent, I think if there's nuclear Armageddon, we're just not going to make it out, and so again, our generation didn't go to war, of course, like the greatest generation. But I recently had read a book that's been surveying 18-year-olds since way back to the 1950s in the United States. And she was noting some of the differences and went back to my generation. She had a picture of a teenager, an 18-year-old from like the mid 1980s, about the time I was an 18-year-old, and showed this young guy, and he's smoking a cigarette and holding a beer in his hand, and just had a certain look. And then, had today's generation with the smartphone huddled up on a couch somewhere, and it's not to say that smoking a cigarette or drinking a beer at 18 years old is at all good behavior, but just was in a picture, kind of a difference in risk taking and maybe how different generations think of things. But, as you think about, risk taking is necessarily a part of being entrepreneurial and being innovative, being an inventor. Culturally, how do you think about that and our capacity for both taking risk, but our capacity for accepting risk as part of the deal?
Yeah, well, just one point: the movies that help spread the angst about nuclear war and so forth. The Day After was quite a latecomer. You go back to this classics like On the Beach and Failsafe, with Henry Fonda as the president and all this sort of stuff. So they've been around for a while, but it's absolutely true. I mean, one of the things that also did happen in the 60s was feminism, and there were parts of the extremely male-oriented culture that basically exalted physical prowess and courage and all that sort of stuff. And quite reasonably, once you get a culture that is essentially sexually balanced, it's going to shift. And I believe that did happen as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you write about the key to flying is energy management, and that an airplane, no matter its form, needs power to stay up and to maintain speed, which is drag. And power comes from three stores. You have to have enough energy in your speed to keep flying, enough to have altitude, and enough in the fuel tank to keep going. But again, you note in the book about kind of a cultural issue that we've had some problems understanding. Well, anyway, environmental concerns have given away to positioning energy as kind of a bad thing. Using more energy, not good. And of course, from an efficiency perspective, being able to do more with less is a good thing. But essentially, energy use also, again, coming from my sort of economist perspective, using more energy is more production. More production is more productivity. More productivity is more wealth. And so if we have a bigger energy footprint per capita, that tends to be a good story, leaving aside environmental issues. But could you talk a little bit about some of your thoughts and what you wrote about on energy?
Yeah, well, I think that's completely the case. That and one of the other legs of that perfect storm was, in fact, the energy flatline that happened in the 70s also. And there were different reasons for it. I mean, this is the sort of thing that happens when you start analyzing this stuff. You go and you find, okay, that happened because of this, but then when did this happen and why? So it's an essentially endless quest to find the deep reasons for these things. But the proximate cause of a lot of our problems was, in fact, the cultural turn against energy and against cars in the 70s. I mean, it was just and it's all based on a complete misconception on the part of people as to what's good and why they are as well off as they are. And I fear a lot of it is simply due to the fact that education has really failed in terms of allowing people to understand the basic sources of goodness and wealth and satisfaction and so forth in the world, and a lot of them are in fact technology. I mean, back in the medieval days, there was this mythological sort of paradise that was variously referred to, but sometimes called Arcadia. And you go and you read the books and stories about it and so forth that were written at the time, and you realize that what they're describing is something that's not actually even as good as what we have now, but definitely compared to what the people who were making up these stories were concerned, we live in heaven. I mean, it's easy to get enough food. It's easy to get good clothing. It's easy to have buildings to live in, and they didn't have that. And what's happened with our education is that we have forgotten just how hard life is without technology. And if you've forgotten that, then it's easy to blame technology for anything without realizing what the actual overall cost trade-offs are. If you don't have technology, the things that technology give you are the ones that you need the most, and that is food, clothing, and shelter for the amount of people that we have in the world now.
Well, you make me smile because I think back to my grandfather, who kind of went across the generation that started out farming. I come from a farming family originally, and he started out farming with horses. And he loved to tell stories. And he would tell stories of the funny things that happen when horse and men try to do things together. And my dad, who certainly knew horses, he was born in 1942, but he would always lean over to me after my grandfather's stories and say, I love your grandfather's stories about horses, but I am glad, Kevin, that we have tractors. and my grandfather was too. And so my grandfather started out life spending hours and hours staring at the back of two horses. And by the end of his life, he was driving a climate-controlled John Deere. It wasn't quite to the era of something that drove itself, although he didn't miss it by more than about 10 years. And then
that's just a huge step.
And he had this way, he had an 8th grade education, but I always think from an economics perspective of how he talked about how the world had changed from when he was young. He and my grandmother got married in 1935, which in the United States is the midst of this thing we call the Great Depression here in the Midwest and in Nebraska, where he was, this thing called the Dust Bowl. So it was just really bad times, but they were optimistic enough to get married and start a family. Anyway, he would just say, in talking about the difference between the world then and the world in the 1980s and 90s, when I was talking to him about this, he would just say, Kevin, we just have more. And it wasn't purely an economic thing. It was just access to more things. We can farm more. We have more access to things that we can buy. We have access to more of life and flourishing. And I've never forgotten that, and that I think it's kind of the full concept for what technology and its progress means to us as individuals.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. This is one of the things I really tried to make the background of the book, but at the same time try to envision how you could keep improving life the way essentially the Industrial Revolution has improved it up to the state that we're in now. Because if you sit there and you look at what it's going to be like after we have full-scale nanotechnology and have colonized the rest of the solar system, and we're using not 1/10,000th of the amount of energy in sunlight that hits the earth, but most of the sunlight that comes out of the sun. And there are not billions of people, but trillions of people, or maybe even more. We're going to look back on this and say, wow, those primitive savages. Because it's possible if you just look at what we can do, look and what's possible with the kind of things that we know we can build. That is a completely possible future for the human race. And it would just be an enormous tragedy if we didn't do it.
And you published the first version of this book in 2018, and he was working on it at the time. But I'm curious, Josh, if we zoom forward to today, 2023, Elon Musk and SpaceX are much further along than they would have been 5 years ago for achieving his vision of settling another planet, but just a whole new level of efficiency, creativity, inventiveness around space travel. And I tell students that I teach in my entrepreneurship class and other things that it's leaving aside maybe the craziness or whatever you want to call it of Elon Musk, that it's great to have these inspirations for just resetting what we think of as the frontiers. Do you think, whether it's Musk and SpaceX or whatever, that we've had some positive dents in sort of the culture for helping people think bigger about how good and how different the future can be?
Yeah, I think so. I think that Musk is a character, but his what he's done is revolutionize spaceflight. for everybody, because everybody now realizes that, yes, it is possible to build a rocket that will land on, the flames in its tail, the way God and Robert Heinlein intended. And and he's the one that made that happen. So he has a tendency to get things done. I mean, like anybody else, especially anybody with lots of money, he, has all sorts of crazy ideas, but and some work and some don't. And but he's one of these guys who just has the will to make it work, whatever it is. And that's why we have, rockets that come back and land now, as opposed to, throwing most of the rocket away after, one shot. I think that the first thing we do, actually, before we do all that much in space, I mean, space is cool. And, I was a huge Star Trek fan and all this sort of stuff back in the 60s, but the reality is that, I mean, basically living on Mars would be like living in Antarctica, except that you'd have to, spend a year in jail every time you tried to leave or get there. There's a huge amount of the existing Earth that is essentially paradise climate all around, basically the middle band of the entire Pacific Ocean, which if you sit there or if you hang out, in the space station above it, you can't see any inhabited land except tiny islands, right? Half of the Earth is essentially sitting there waiting for us. And a huge amount of that half of the Earth is gorgeous, beautiful climate. So all we have to do is be able to live in the ocean. I mean, either below it if we want to, or on top of it if we want to. But that's what the technology of the 21st century is going to do. I think space is really going to happen in the 22nd century. Once it starts kind of looking crowded in the Pacific Ocean, then people say, "Oh man, there's too many people here. Let's go to Mars." But
so let's get the Tahiti's settled before we worry about another planet.
Well, I think they're going to happen at the same time. It's just that the oceans are going to happen first because they're just that much more accessible. Right now, one of the major problems is simply legal issues. I mean, the powers that be simply don't have that sorted out yet. But the ocean floor, without even digging in it, but the ocean floor has huge amount of minerals that we need, and that we're paying through the nose to get from China, who is happy to cut them off, kind of the same way we're happy to cut off chips to them. I mean, but it's gonna keep happening. And whereas you go to the ocean and the metal nodules are just lying there, so it's an interesting legal question as to whose they are, but that's the sort of thing that ultimately gets sorted over time, a lot slower than you would wish, but it does. And so there's huge amounts of resources. There's excellent climate. There's the best thing in the world, which is distance between you and your nearest neighbor, at least for me. And well, I mean, the thing is, there's some people that like going in crowded bars. So do I. But you get a flying car and you fly to a crowded bar if you want to. But if you don't want to hear the neighbor's lousy music, the further away you are is the better.
Well, you write about failures that have prevented flying cars and much else, and regulatory legal issues that are just hard to navigate. In the case of the example you just gave of how do we mine the ocean bottom when it doesn't belong to a country, or at least doesn't have the traditional sort of property rights as we understand it. But you write about increasing centralization and bureaucratization, if I can say the word right, of science and research funding, regulatory overreach, litigation you mentioned earlier is taking out kind of the private plane industry, if you will. And you write about the failure of imagination as well. What do you think about as some of the most significant of those barriers that you've wrote about in the book and that we've touched on so far? What's the most significant barrier, and how do we overcome it?
Well, you've touched on some of my favorite phrases there that I have to give credit to Arthur C. Clarke, who wrote in 1962 Profiles of the Future, which stands as one of the best books of futurism to come out of that era. It's the only one that still holds up today. I mean, all the quote serious unquote ones look very pedestrian and out of date, whereas Clarke, was a giant in the field. So, but he had two kinds of failures of prediction, and one was the failure of nerve, and the other one was the failure of the imagination. And failure of nerve was basically refusing to realize that given what you already know, something is going to be possible. And failure of the imagination is failure to understand that there are unknown unknowns, and that ultimately you can't predict the future, and so you have to just take a flyer and say, all right, suppose we could do this.
Yeah, entrepreneurs invent the future. You try to predict it, but you have to invent it.
Well, here's a let's look at a real unexpected occurrence in major technological breakthrough that should have been expected but wasn't. And this is today's artificial intelligence. I spent a lot of years, and in fact, I got it about the middle of the 80s. I came to the realization that we were not going to solve artificial intelligence by writing more and more intricately ingenious programs on the little computers that we had then, but we were going to basically solve it by building giant hulking computers that actually has as much processing power as the human brain, and the algorithms would just come because we evolved, and a lot of the stuff that goes on is inside of our minds as well as our bodies is not super ingenious. It just takes the enormous power of the biological process and of the
processing power
to do what it does, right? So as we used to say at Rutgers in the computer science department, it works by brute force and massive ignorance. So that's what happened. People built computers that are so mind-bogglingly powerful that they could take the same machine learning algorithms that we used in the 80s and apply them to essentially all human knowledge in the form of all the text on the internet, and boom. And all of a sudden, there's artificial intelligence, not as smart as it could be or is going to be in a month. But it's moving that fast now. But because people looked at it and simply refused to understand that, here we have the algorithms, all we have to do is build the machines and run them. That was a failure of nerve. They should have been able to say, okay, this is probably going to happen. In my AI book, I did kind of predict something along those lines. So I'll chalk one up for myself as a predictor. But that's what happened. Now the thing is that there's also failures of the imagination about, for example, different power sources. Everybody's going to say, okay, we're going to invent this thing to get energy, that thing to get energy, and so forth and so on. And there's just a lot of stuff we don't know. And it's very dangerous as a futurist in terms of getting things right. It's very dangerous to simply assume that anything you don't know about can't happen, because there's a lot you don't know and a lot that will happen even though you don't know about it. And so that's the other failure from Clark's analysis. And that's, of course, the really interesting one. I mean, but on the other hand, the failure of nerve is something that you can sit down and force yourself to think it over and get it right, whereas failure of imagination is, requires imagination.
Yeah, I put it to students that it is a training process. I say there's maybe this perception that people like surprise, because I say at least part of this whole thing of looking for the unexpected, the unpredictable, is the search for surprise. But I think a very natural human tendency is that we don't like surprise very much. And so our reaction to it oftentimes is, no, I don't like that. And so...
Yeah, we should. That's why it's so hard to be a scientist. I mean, you go back to information theory.
Claude Shannon.
It turns out that information and surprise are the same thing. Okay, so when you don't like surprise, you're basically forcing yourself not to learn. Whereas, and the tough part about being a scientist is saying, okay, here's something I don't know. I'm going to go out and force myself to be surprised.
Yeah. Well, as part of rereading your book in preparation for this interview, I also went to your author website, which we will link to, and you had written an essay that I think probably lent itself to your later books called Ethics for Machines. And it was quite good. And in that, you wrote, the novel feature of an ethical evolution is the claim that there is a moral sense, a particular facility beyond, and to some extent in control of, our general cognitive abilities, which host a mimetic code which co-evolves with societies. So, completely,
When
with
you
the
say
bias.
that 3 times fast, I mean, seriously. That was, boy, I was being pontificating there.
Well, essentially what I wanted to ask Josh was, is there an ethical element to being entrepreneurial and innovative? Because I think that's part of what you're getting at in there, but I thought I would let you comment on that.
Well, to coin a phrase, abso-goddamn-lutely. That's the best, the most altruistic members of society are the inventors. I mean, this is why our lives are better than they were 100 years ago, or 200, or much better than they were 300 years ago. It's inventions. I mean, that is the one thing you can leave to the world that everybody can have, and the amount of good that comes out of the amount of effort is the highest ratio for an inventor. I mean, of all the people. I seriously believe that, and I've tried to be a little bit of an inventor myself, but then after a while, you get old, and all you can do is write books.
Still a contribution and an invention, I hope. Well, Josh, thank you for your book. I will read your others as well, but is there any last thoughts you would like to leave with our listeners and our viewers?
Yeah, the one thing we didn't hit on here is nanotechnology. And I just got tapped by the CGO at Utah to write a primer for policymakers about nanotechnology. So I've gotten back into it, and I'm realizing that flying cars are a small thing compared to the huge reorganization of our technology that true nanotechnology would bring. And I talk about that a lot in the flying car book, because as I say, it had started out to be my memoirs, and And that was one of the things when I was the president of Foresight that I tried to get people to go back and look at what Feynman had proposed doing, and that we never did. And, and it's still sitting there waiting to be done. And so, if anybody wants to, A, change the world, and B, make literally $1 trillion, go back and run through Feynman's project for creating nanotechnology, and things will happen.
Well, it can apply, as you write in the book, to the mechanical world, potentially to the flying car world. But, one of the recent entrepreneurs who I interviewed on this show, Joel Harris, founder of a company called Genvax, is making mRNA-based vaccines for the animal industry, but using a nanoparticle to make those vaccines at least potentially much more effective, much more precise. And it's just, again, kind of these different technologies coming together, but hopefully something very tangible coming from nanotechnology in a part of the world that you couldn't have imagined until an entrepreneur begins to make it happen.
Absolutely.
Well, Josh, thank you very much for being a part of it. Thank you for inventing your books and your thoughts on that, and for sharing with us today.
Thanks for inviting me. I had a great time.